Greetings, everybody. I hope you're all doing pretty well. I have to apologize about the sound quality. I'm working on an oil rig right now. There's quite a few generators not far from here. It's pretty loud, and also some of the machinery behind me makes a lot of noise. And so, if the sound quality is not the best on this, I do apologize. Not a lot I can do about it. I really wanted to make this video kind of spur of the moment uh, on a topic that I did one of the I think within the first month that I started making videos way back in 2011, and I haven't touched on it since, I don't believe. And that is the topic of the Oklahoma City bombing. And it seems especially prescient right now, and it didn't even occur to me because where I'm working right now is actually Oklahoma City. I think I'm either in the city limits or very close to it, and I've only been here a little over a week. Kind of came up pretty quick, and you know, as important as Oklahoma City bombing was in my development as a political thinker and how I view the state, it's something that it's not always in the back of my mind. So I fail to realize that not only am I in Oklahoma City, a place that kind of figures prominently in my political zeitgeist, but it happens to be the 20th anniversary of the bombing, and also 20 years since I was last in the city. I very briefly drove through Oklahoma City um, in 1995 um, in the summer, so it's a few months after the bombing, and I haven't been back since. And just have been here about a week, and I was looking over the anarcho-capitalist subreddit, and somebody had posted a little mini documentary about Timothy McVeigh, I think titled something along the lines of The Secret Life of Tim McVeigh. I will put a link in the description if I remember, if I can, to that documentary. And I just really, I don't know, I felt that it seemed very serendipitous, like it should be done. Um, Interesting things about Oklahoma City that I've noticed is if you're my age, you obviously remember it was a big deal. I think that I was right at the age of like where abstract thought becomes something you actively do. Often, a question, did I become politically aware or philosophically aware because of events like Oklahoma City and Waco, or was it just that I was at the right age to become politically aware at that point, and those events were just, you know, uh, big news stories that were brought up these issues a lot? I don't know. I guess probably a little bit of both. Um, what's interesting though is like, and what's pertinent about this is, I did make a video about it in 2011. Back then, very few people watched my channel, so that video likely has a few hundred views or less. Um, but most libertarians, I think, are basically unaware of this event in any kind of detailed knowledge. They don't know anything other than maybe that it happened. And I noticed in the subreddit someone had even said, well, I always believed that 9/11 was an inside job. Um, but I don't really know anything about Oklahoma City. I went through the whole 9/11 truth movement, and I have to say, although there's a lot there that I do find interesting, maybe even compelling, I think there's way more speculation and um, way more sensationalism than there is fact. Whereas in Oklahoma City, although there's been a lot of sensationalism, there's plenty of conspiracy theorists out there who have jumped to absurd conclusions. There's a lot of things that we can say for sure, and the things that we can say for sure paint a very ugly picture indeed. Um, I'm not going to relate everything here. I've read a couple books on it. There's a good one by Tim McVeigh's lawyer called Others Unknown. There's another one called Oklahoma City. I believe it's called The Final Story. I don't remember. It's been a couple of years since I read it. Um, it's probably why I made that other video. Well, I'll put a link to this, but some of the basics. This event happened, and within a day or two, it came out. Tim McVeigh was indicted. He was arrested for not having a license plate while driving north of Oklahoma City. Uh, he was put into a county jail, and eyewitnesses, reported that there had been a Ryder truck parked in front of the Merrill building, the building that was bombed, and that um, with the presumption being that this truck had been filled with explosives, which it probably was, and that it has, that it was what was responsible for the bombing, and people reported, well, we saw this guy, and this guy they described sounded like Tim McVeigh, and they were able to indict this guy. There was actually a brief period where it looked like he might be let go because he was pulled over for a minor offense. They found some pretext to keep him in there, I think maybe to check him for disease or something like that, medical checkup, uh, until they could acquire more information to indict him on the bombing and more than just the license plate. But what's interesting is all the eyewitnesses who saw him with the Ryder truck and elsewhere saw him with other people, at least one other person, sometimes more. And so the indictment was against him and, quote, others unknown, which is the title of his lawyer's book. I think his lawyer's name is Stephen Jones. I might be remembering that wrong. That's a good book, though. It's a good book of how the legal case against him was so shaky, which indeed it was, which is not to say he wasn't involved. I think clearly he was. In exactly what capacity, we would have to speculate. But I think he was involved, but other people were involved, and every witness who saw him said so. And one great thing about this documentary is that it shows, Janet Reno, FBI directors, the governor, all these people coming out and saying, we're looking for John Doe number 2. The biggest manhunt in the history of the United States was for this John Doe number 2, this accomplice of Tim McVeigh, who may have escaped, he may have been killed in the bombing. There's a whole other, there's so many interesting turns in this story. I recommend anybody to really research it. I can recommend a couple books, a couple interviews. Scott Horton on Anti-War Radio, whatever you want to say about him, has interviewed many of the people who've done most of the reporting on this. There's a couple people, some journalists. There's a lawyer whose brother was involved in this, who has done a lot of research and uncovered a lot of documents, government documents, pertaining to this event. But Scott Horton has a great series of interviews about Oklahoma City, for those who are interested. I think they may even be organized along those lines. It's been a couple of years since I checked his archives, but I think he's made it so you can, and I mean, you could listen to probably 10, 15 hours of stuff on that. Anyway, McVeigh's lawyer kind of pointed out, well, eventually after a month or 2 months, the FBI came out and said there is no such thing as John Doe number 2. It was a mistake. And they dismissed all the witness testimony, which apparently there were at least 24 witnesses who saw both McVeigh and this other person the day of the bombing with the truck. They said those people all just imagined that other person. They're unreliable witnesses when it comes to their testimony regarding John Doe number 2. His lawyer points out, if you're going to say that a witness is unreliable, can't be trusted, then about their testimony regarding John Doe number 2, then their testimony can't be regarded as rock solid or influential or pertinent regarding Timothy McVeigh. So if you're going to throw out their testimony for John Doe number 2, you have to throw out their testimony for Tim McVeigh, without which there isn't that much of a case with him. The other thing is the lawyer pointed out, if indeed there were other people with him, there's the reasonable doubt that it wasn't him, it was them. I could very easily go for a car ride with somebody, and one of us could commit a crime, and the other could very plausibly say they had no idea that was going to happen. We were just hanging out, and the crime happened unbeknownst. And his lawyer points out that the way that the trial went wasn't based on the evidence, wasn't based on, how the fact that the FBI was ignoring or saying all these witnesses were unreliable regarding other potential perpetrators. It was a case of, let's look at pictures of all the dead bodies, of all the dead children, like, it's a terrible crime, and then look at this mean man, this mean, growling looking fellow. And juries can be swayed by emotion like that all the time. I watched another documentary, unrelated case, about a guy who was falsely convicted of murder, and the jury was just like, somebody had to go to jail, somebody had to be punished. Sure, there wasn't a ton of evidence against this guy, but somebody had to do it. Might as well have been him. And to hear McVeigh's lawyer talk about it, that's what happened. But it's long been alleged or speculated that McVeigh was working for the government, and that he was actually and he had worked for the government. That's not I mean, that's officially known. He was in the military, but many people speculated for years that he remained in the military after his discharge. He joined in 1988. He was in the first Gulf War, and then he was discharged. Uh, and many people, if you read the testimonies of the people who interacted with him in the early 90s, he basically was working the gun show circuit, going from gun show to gun show, which a lot of people do. And a lot of merchants make a living doing this, but apparently he wasn't making a living doing it. He wasn't selling guns or buying anything like that. He was distributing anti-government propaganda. He's giving out Lon Horiuchi's address, talking about the militia, talking about overthrowing tyrants, liberty, all that kind of stuff that would resonate with many people here, many libertarians. And it's all well and good, except you can't really make any money doing that, or at least it seems difficult. Um, and many people began to wonder if perhaps he was working for the government. Um, this documentary, which I'm going to link to, actually provides some strong evidence that this is indeed what happened. It refers to a process called sheep dipping. I've never heard this term before, and I like this documentary just for introducing me to this term. It introduces the term, and then it provides evidence that it's a legitimate practice. Basically, the idea is that the government will take people in the military, in this case, although presumably with other agencies as well, and makes it look as though formally they have left the institution. So you get discharged from the military, and all the paperwork ends, but this is all a facade. You continue to work for the military. Your records are kept secret, even though you go back, change your civilian status, all this stuff. And they reference a book by a guy who ran operations, who was in the military. And let me see if I can't find this book so no one can say I didn't reference it. Let's see, I already put it on my wish list, so. The Secret Team, the CIA and its Allies in Control of the World by L. Fletcher Prouty, Prouty, and that name sounds really familiar, so I think it's probably been out there before. But he's the source for the use of the term sheep dipping. And the idea being you want to do covert operations that can't be done officially. Apparently this is recorded, it happened in Vietnam. It was against the law, the international law, to deploy troops to Cambodia or Laos, so the military sheep dipped some people, made them into civilians, and then sent them to Cambodia and Laos to run, radar stations or something like that, as Boeing employees. So this is apparently a real thing that happens. When I've talked to military people, and I haven't asked them specifically about the term, but whenever I've known military people well enough that I can have a conversation, which is a few now, the idea that they run covert operations is not shocking. It's not something that they reject. It's rather mundane. In fact, some of you remember the video I did called The Cost of War, where I talked to a veteran out of killing himself. We've had other conversations, and he talks about, not in detail, but he confirms, but he claims, as a confirmation, but he talked a lot about covert actions, covert deployments, not in the United States, though in other places like Africa. Talked a lot about Africa. He wouldn't say where. I said I have to ask. I'm just dying to know, but he won't say. I have my suspicions. I did actually bring up, because this comes up with Waco. There was alleged in Waco that Delta Force was there, that they were on the ground, running surveillance and possibly taking part in the butchery. And when I ran that past this guy, it was interesting. His reaction was he's glad all those guys died, not the Davidians, the Special Forces guys, which they did. A lot of those Special Forces guys. This is the allegation. Were the same guys who were deployed to Mogadishu a year later and who died, or later that year even, and who died. I think one of the guys who was given a posthumous Medal of Honor may well have been stationed at Waco. Who's the source on that? The source, I actually called Scott Horton and asked him about that, and he said the source on that is the producer of the Waco, The Rules of Engagement documentary. Um, yeah, that's a whole other story. But basically, all the military people that I know accept that this happens, which isn't to say it specifically happened in the case of McVeigh. But what's interesting is a letter was published by the New York Times from McVeigh to his sister, where he says he was trying to become a special forces soldier. He had to take a whole bunch of tests, and at one point they were called to formation. They had about 400 people, and they read off 10 social security numbers. They said, if you call your social security number, we're going to talk to you. He says that he was told, you did very well on these tests, you're an intelligent guy, you have the right aptitude, we have special work for you, special missions, and basically a special unit where you're going to appear to be a civilian, but you're going to continue to work for the military. Now, this was published in the New York Times, and their only kind of rebuttal of it is to say the government denies that this is true. Okay, well, they would deny it, which doesn't prove that it's true, but there's evidence that suggests that it may be, because in addition to the fact that he had no money, that he had no visible job, and he was doing things that ultimately played very much in the hands of the government. There's videotape of him at a military base in fatigues, operating military equipment a year and a half after his official withdrawal from the military. And the documentary that I'll link to show has that video. Um, so that right there is very strong evidence that he continued to work for the government. Not only did he continue to work for the government and the military, he continued to do so secretly. Uh, Now, if you're an anti-government person, militia, whatever, it's obvious if you think about it that attacks like the Oklahoma City bombing are beneficial to the government. They generate sympathy. They make the government look like a victim, which is very odd. It's very difficult for them to actually be a victim. It allows them to crack down. There had been legislation introduced 2 days or 2 months before Oklahoma City by none other than Joe Biden that was languishing in committee because it was so authoritarian. This was kind of like the genesis of the Patriot Act, really, that passed a year later, but largely and explicitly because of Oklahoma City. It saved Bill Clinton's presidency. It very much helped um, organizations like the ATF and the FBI, which were getting bad raps in the early 90s because of what had happened at Ruby Ridge and Waco. Um, Deservedly bad raps for what was happening there. And this event helped all these, the federal government, these particular agencies. Bill Clinton admitted after his reelection in 1996 that he had all these scandals, all this stuff was happening, and that this event, even though nominally there's nothing you can logically say he did to prevent it or to rectify it or anything, helped him enormously just because it got on the screen and shed his fucking crocodile tears about the children that were killed, and his popularity was buoyed quite a bit. Now, which is not to say necessarily that he orchestrated or whatever, just that he benefited. Um, if I had to speculate what actually was going on, it's very hard to tell. Um, It may have been a false flag. It may have been a provocateur. There's a lot of provocateuring. This is the story you get from the early 90s that um, government agents were going to militias, whatever, the proto-Tea Party, and basically encouraging people to do violent things. Um, Something that they still do. Something that they do today with Muslim extremists all the time. Every time they thwart a terrorist attack, it's somebody who they've encouraged through the attack. It's a provocateur. When actual terrorists try and do something, the government can't stop them. They never do. The only people they stop are the people they provocateur themselves. I don't want to go into all the details, A, because there's so many, and B, because I don't remember them all. But I would have people look up Carol Howe, I think Carol Howe, who was an ATF informant in the circles that McVeigh ran. There's a whole cast of characters. Like, it's juicy reading. It's interesting reading. One can't draw very specific, definite conclusions, but that the government was involved, or at the very least that they knew. Their fingerprints are all over it, sometimes officially, is it's very iconoclastic stuff if you believe, you know, that they're there to protect us, because this demonstrates either that they can't or that they're actively aggressive against their own citizens. Um, that's why I think the narrative is has such resonance. There's also a lot to be said about the miscarriage of justice, um, in terms of the trial, in terms of how this was all handled. Um, McVeigh himself, my hunch for a long time was that his actions didn't make a lot of sense in terms of not being a government agent. In fact, I've even read, you know, people who talked to him, he would admit attacks like this, terrorism like this, buoys the government. It helps the government. Well, if he understood that, which clearly he did, he's a smart guy. Even if there weren't people relating, witnessing him saying this, you could infer he would be smart enough to know this. An action like this is sure to help the government. Sure to help the government. It's not going to cause people to rise up. Only a fool, only a fool could ever believe that something like this would have that effect. Which begs the question then, if he was aware of that, why would he do it? And it's because that's what he was going for. That's not necessarily, and it wasn't his motivation necessarily. He could just be following orders. He could just be doing what they're telling him. And then the big question to that is, well, if he would he be willing to do that when the cost is the death penalty? Because he was ostensibly executed in June or July of 2001 in Terre Haute, Indiana. And maybe he wasn't executed, you know. Uh, the documentary that I'll link to shows some evidence, not evidence, but grounds to believe that it's not necessarily what happened. Or maybe they could tell him that they weren't going to execute him and then do it anyway. Um, fascinating, fascinating story. Um, his actions, if you watch the interviews with him, very strange, very measured in a way that's does not make sense. The person who the domestic terrorist who did these things would not say and do the things that he did. Um, but a government provocateur, sure. So I highly recommend people look into Oklahoma City. Um, if for no other reason that it's extremely fascinating. Um, it's an underappreciated event post 9/11. 9/11 happened, and I mean, I've talked about there are people young enough who 9/11 is in the past, who weren't even around or certainly have no memories of Oklahoma City. But this was a major, major event in the United States, and for some of us, it was personally a major event, not because I lost anybody or because I was traumatized, but because it got me thinking. This and Waco, these were the two things that in the mid 90s kind of were the genesis of my political awareness, um, which I think is if what I speculate is true, is an ironic um, reaction to government policy. But yeah, so I'm going to keep this pretty short because I don't know what else I want to say other than I'm here. It seemed very serendipitous to talk about it. It's been a long time since I have. Very few people would have watched my earlier videos just because I didn't have hardly any subscribers at that point. Um, and yeah, I mean, I guess that's pretty much it. If anyone has any questions, I'll try and put links to as much as I can in the description. Interviews. Scott Horton, again, has done a lot of research on this or interviewed a lot of people. People look up Jesse Trenadu. So the stories are so crazy. John Doe number 2 is described. I mean, he's on the TV. He was described as being like 5'8", build, olive skin, and a tattoo on his left arm. And there's a guy named, what is it? Something Trenadu. I forget. And he was a bit of a ruffian. I'm sorry, I thought I was going to end, and I'm going to add this little detail. He was a sketchy character, but he was like the black sheep. His older brother, I think whose name was Jesse, um, was more high functioning, and his little brother turned up dead in an FBI prison. They say of suicide, but he had clearly been beaten. And unfortunately for the government, his brother was a lawyer, and through revealing court documents, has uncovered a lot of stuff about Oklahoma City, PATCOM, an operation to infiltrate, an official operation to infiltrate and discredit right-wing organizations, especially militias in the United States. So I'll try and put as many links as I can underneath, but very fascinating, very worth researching and reading about. And I don't know, welcome to Oklahoma City. I'm loving the tornadoes. I'll talk to y'all later.